billionaire thought she was stealing from him. He had no idea she was saving someone's life with half a sandwich. Every afternoon, at precisely 12:10 p.m., from when the lunch bell echoed through the red brick halls of Jefferson Elementary, Emily Carter would sit at the far end of the cafeteria table, shoulders small, beneath a faded denim jacket 2 sizes too big. The other kids tore into their pizza slices and chocolate milk cartons, laughing loud enough to rattle the folding chairs, but Emily moved carefully, like every bite had to be negotiated. She would eat exactly half of her turkey sandwich, count out 6 baby carrots, sip only a little from her milk, and then, glancing once over her shoulder, wrap the rest in a napkin and slip it into her backpack. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't clumsy. It was practiced. Across the cafeteria, Jonathan Hayes stood near the stainless steel serving line, sleeves rolled up over a tailored dress shirt, watching the program he funded in action. $5 million a year to ensure no child in this district went hungry. That was the promise. He had built an empire out of logistics and steel, measuring success in square footage and quarterly returns. But hunger was something he understood from childhood, from nights when the refrigerator hummed louder than his mother's tired voice. So when he noticed the small girl systematically pocketing food 3 days in a row, something tightened in his chest. Not anger, not yet. Suspicion. Rules mattered. Fairness mattered. Charity only worked if it wasn't abused. On the 4th day, as Emily zipped her worn backpack and slipped quietly from her seat before the final bell, Jonathan made a decision he hadn't planned on making. He would follow her, just to make sure. Jonathan waited until the hallway emptied, before stepping outside into the pale October sunlight, keeping enough distance so his polished leather shoes would not echo too close behind the small pair of worn sneakers moving ahead of him. Emily walked with purpose, not like a child wandering, but like someone who had memorized every crack in the sidewalk. She did not join the cluster of students heading toward the yellow school buses lined up along Maple Street. Instead, she turned right, passing the corner gas station, then continued 3 blocks past the neighborhood of tidy lawns and white picket fences that Jonathan's foundation brochures loved to photograph. The houses thinned, the sidewalks narrowed. A chain-link fence leaned crooked along an empty lot where weeds pushed through broken concrete. Jonathan slowed his pace, adjusting his jacket as if he were simply taking an afternoon stroll, yet his attention never left the small blue backpack bouncing lightly against her back. He told himself he was protecting the integrity of the meal program. He told himself responsibility required vigilance. But as he followed her past a boarded-up laundromat and a grocery store with darkened windows, a quiet unease settled in his chest. This was not the direction of convenience stores or playground shortcuts. This was the direction people avoided after sunset. Emily did not hesitate. She crossed the railroad tracks carefully, stepping between the wooden ties, then glanced around once before slipping through a narrow opening in a rusted gate. Jonathan stopped just short of the fence, his heartbeat louder than the distant hum of traffic. Through the gap, he saw the outline of an abandoned brick building with shattered windows and a sagging roofline, and without fully understanding why he felt certain that whatever waited inside had nothing to do with theft, Jonathan hesitated only a moment before slipping through the same narrow opening in the rusted gate, careful not to let the metal scrape too loudly against his coat. The air inside the lot felt different, heavier, as though the city had decided to forget this corner of it. Dry leaves skittered across cracked pavement, and somewhere nearby a loose sheet of tin tapped rhythmically in the wind. Emily moved straight toward the abandoned brick building, its windows clouded with dust and streaked by years of rain. She did not look afraid. She looked familiar with it. She climbed the 3 shallow concrete steps leading to a side entrance where the door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Jonathan kept several yards back, positioning himself behind a leaning utility pole near the wall. Through the narrow gap of the doorway, he saw her small frame disappear into the dim interior. For a second, there was only silence. Then he heard it. A faint cough. Not loud, not dramatic, just weak, persistent, the kind of sound that lingered in the air longer than it should. Jonathan felt his assumptions begin to unravel. This was not the hiding place of a mischievous child. This sounded like something fragile. He stepped closer, careful, steady, until he could see through the cracked doorway. Inside, sunlight filtered through broken panes, casting long beams across a dusty floor where a thin blanket had been laid out against the far wall. Emily knelt down, setting her backpack gently beside her. She unwrapped the napkin with deliberate care, as if unveiling something precious. Jonathan held his breath, not out of fear of being caught, but because whatever he was about to witness felt like it would change the story he had already written in his mind. Emily smoothed the napkin across her lap before lifting the sandwich with both hands, turning slightly toward the figure resting against the wall. The woman lying there looked far too thin for her age. Her light brown hair pulled back loosely, her face pale but gentle. A folded sweater served as a pillow beneath her head, and a small battery-powered lantern flickered beside her, casting a warm circle of light in the otherwise dim room. Emily offered the sandwich first, holding it up with quiet determination. The woman gave a tired smile and tried to shake her head, but another soft cough interrupted her. Jonathan felt something shift inside him. He had expected mischief. He had expected dishonesty. He had not expected this. He leaned closer to the doorway, careful to remain unseen, his hand resting against the rough brick, as if he needed it to steady himself. Emily spoke in a soft, steady voice that carried clearly through the still air. She explained that she had brought turkey today because it was her mother's favorite, and that the carrots were sweet this time. There was no complaint in her tone, no trace of self-pity, only care. The woman reached up slowly, brushing a loose strand of hair from Emily's face, whispering that she should have eaten more at school. Emily shook her head firmly and insisted she had already eaten enough. Jonathan watched the exchange in silence, feeling the weight of every assumption he had made pressing down on him. The building around them was cracked and worn, but in that narrow beam of light the scene felt almost sacred. A child dividing her meal with mathematical precision. A mother trying to refuse out of love. The napkin crinkled softly as Emily placed the sandwich into her mother's hands. Jonathan swallowed hard, aware that the story unfolding in front of him was not about rules or policy or program oversight. It was about survival and devotion measured in halves. Jonathan remained just outside the doorway, the late afternoon light stretching his shadow across the cracked concrete floor, but not quite reaching them. He could hear the faint rustle of paper as Emily adjusted the napkin again, tearing the sandwich into even smaller pieces to make it last longer. Her mother, Sarah Carter, took a careful bite, chewing slowly, as if each mouthful required effort. The lantern flickered once, then steadied, illuminating the tired gratitude in Sarah's eyes. Emily poured a little of the milk from her carton into a chipped plastic cup she had brought from somewhere, holding it with both hands so it would not spill. She reminded her mother to drink, speaking with a seriousness that did not belong to a child her age. Jonathan noticed the details he had missed before. A folded blanket neatly arranged, a small stack of library books tied together with twine, a paper calendar taped to the wall with certain days circled in pencil. This was not chaos. This was careful endurance. He felt heat rise to his face, not from anger, but from shame. He had walked into this neighborhood prepared to confront dishonesty. Instead, he was witnessing quiet dignity surviving inside broken walls. When Sarah tried again to push the food back toward her daughter, Emily gently closed her mother's fingers around the sandwich and whispered that she had promised to bring more tomorrow. There was no accusation in that promise, only certainty. Jonathan's chest tightened at the word tomorrow. He had spent decades building companies that forecasted years ahead, yet this child measured life in single days, in single meals. The sound of another soft cough echoed through the room, fragile but persistent. Jonathan realized he was gripping the brick doorway so firmly that dust clung to his palm. He had believed generosity was about writing checks and funding programs. Standing there unseen, he began to understand that generosity without understanding could become distance, and distance had almost made him blind. Jonathan finally stepped back from the doorway, his breath slow and uneven, as if he had just run farther than his body was prepared for. He did not want to interrupt them. He did not want to turn their quiet ritual into a spectacle. So he remained outside, listening to the low murmur of Emily's voice as she described her day at school, carefully choosing the parts that would make her mother smile. She mentioned a spelling quiz she thought she had done well on, and a drawing she had taped inside her desk. She did not mention the way other children sometimes stared at her worn shoes. She did not mention hunger. Jonathan understood that omission more than anything else. Pride had a sound. It sounded like a child protecting her parent from worry. A cool breeze drifted through the broken windows, carrying the faint scent of rust and fallen leaves. The sky beyond the shattered glass had begun to soften into early evening gold, and Jonathan realized that time was moving whether he was ready or not. He thought about walking in, introducing himself, offering help immediately. But something held him back. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was the knowledge that help given too quickly could feel like exposure. Inside, Sarah asked softly whether anyone had noticed. Emily paused for a fraction of a second before answering no. The lie was gentle, protective. Jonathan felt it land heavily in his chest. He had noticed. He had followed. He had judged. The reality of that settled over him like weight. He took out his phone not to call security or alert anyone but to silence it completely, as if even a ringtone would be disrespectful in this fragile space. For the first time in years, the billionaire who negotiated mergers worth billions of dollars felt uncertain about his next move. Money had always provided solutions. This felt different. This required presence, humility, patience. He glanced once more through the doorway and saw Emily tuck the empty napkin carefully into her backpack, leaving no crumbs behind. Even in scarcity, she cleaned up. Even in hardship, she honored dignity. And Jonathan understood that whatever he chose to do next would have to honor that same dignity. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cracked floor, as Emily helped her mother lean back against the wall. She folded the thin blanket more securely around Sarah's shoulders, tucking the edges with the careful precision of someone who had learned through repetition. Jonathan noticed how light Sarah felt when Emily adjusted her, how little resistance there was in her movement. Even from several yards away, he could see the fatigue written across her face. The cough returned slightly stronger this time, lingering in the hollow space of the building before fading into silence. Emily reached for the lantern and checked the battery compartment, giving it a small shake, as if willing it to last another night. She then pulled one of the library books from the tied stack and opened it, offering to read aloud. Her voice rose softly in the empty room, steady and deliberate, filling the abandoned walls with something that sounded like hope. Jonathan felt the contrast sharply. Outside these walls, traffic flowed, businesses closed for the evening, families gathered around dinner tables. Inside, survival was measured in batteries and half sandwiches in borrowed light. A chill crept into the air as the temperature dropped with the fading daylight, likely near 50 degrees now, and Jonathan instinctively wrapped his coat tighter around himself. Emily did not have a coat on her mother, only the blanket, and her own small hands smoothing it down. The realization struck him with sudden clarity. Night would come soon. This building had no heat, no insulation, no protection from the cold. The program he funded ensured lunch. It did nothing for nights like this. Sarah's breathing grew heavier as Emily continued reading, pausing occasionally to ask if she was comfortable. Jonathan understood then that this was not a temporary inconvenience. This was an ongoing struggle. And if he walked away now, he would not simply be returning to his car. He would be choosing distance again. The wind pushed harder against the broken windows, and for the first time, Jonathan felt the urgency rising inside him. Tomorrow was not guaranteed to be easier than today. Emily's voice softened as she reached the end of the chapter, closing the library book with careful fingers, as if the story inside might spill out if handled too roughly. Sarah's eyes had drifted half-closed, her breathing shallow but steady for the moment. The lantern flickered again, weaker now, casting unsteady shadows that stretched and shrank along the cracked brick walls. Jonathan checked his watch without thinking. It was nearly 6 o'clock. In less than an hour, the temperature would drop further, likely into the low 40s. He knew the forecast. He had glanced at it that morning while sipping coffee in a kitchen larger than this entire building. The contrast pressed against him with uncomfortable force. Inside, Emily stood and walked to the doorway, peering out as if measuring the remaining daylight. For a split second, Jonathan stepped back into the deeper shadow beside the wall, not wanting to frighten her. She wrapped her arms around herself, rubbing her sleeves as the wind pushed through the broken windows behind her. Then she returned to her mother and adjusted the blanket again, pressing her small palm against Sarah's forehead, the way she had likely seen nurses do. She whispered something too quiet for him to hear, but her expression tightened briefly, concern slipping through her practiced calm. Jonathan felt urgency sharpen inside him. He could not ignore the fragility of the situation any longer. Yet he also understood that barging in unannounced could shatter the fragile trust that held this space together. He took one slow breath, steadying himself. For decades, he had entered boardrooms with confidence, making decisions that shifted markets. Now, standing outside an abandoned building, he felt the weight of a different kind of responsibility. The lantern dimmed once more, nearly fading before glowing weakly again. Night was arriving, whether they were ready or not. Jonathan realized that if he waited much longer, he would no longer be choosing the right moment. He would be choosing silence. The last of the daylight slipped behind the distant rooftops, leaving the inside of the abandoned building washed in a dull blue-gray that made everything feel colder than it already was. The lantern sputtered once more, before dimming to a faint glow, barely strong enough to outline the curve of Sarah's face against the blanket. Emily noticed immediately. She picked up the lantern, tapped the side gently, then unscrewed the battery compartment with small, careful hands. She shook the batteries and placed them back inside, twisting the cap tight, her lips pressed together in concentration. For a moment the light brightened, then weakened again, as if it were breathing its last. A thin draft slid through the cracked window panes, and Jonathan felt it even from the doorway. If he could feel it through a tailored wool coat, then the chill against Sarah's frail frame must have been sharper. Emily crouched beside her mother and pulled the blanket higher, then removed her own denim jacket and laid it across Sarah's chest without hesitation. The temperature was likely hovering around 45 degrees now and falling steadily. Sarah stirred, whispering that Emily should keep the jacket on. Emily shook her head and said she was warm, though her arms trembled slightly as she folded them across her thin sweater. The cough returned longer this time, leaving Sarah breathless for a few seconds before it eased. Emily leaned close, her forehead nearly touching her mother's, whispering reassurance in a tone that tried to sound braver than she felt. Jonathan's pulse quickened. This was no longer simply a matter of discomfort. The cold, the fading light, the fragile breathing. It all converged into something urgent and undeniable. He reached into his pocket for his phone, then paused again, wrestling with the line between intrusion and intervention. Inside, Emily glanced toward the doorway once more, perhaps sensing movement, perhaps only checking the darkening sky. For a heartbeat, their eyes nearly met through the shadows, and Jonathan stepped back just in time to remain unseen. The lantern flickered one final time and went out completely, plunging the room into near darkness, broken only by the faint silver of moonlight filtering through shattered glass. Emily's voice, softer now but steady, filled the quiet as she told her mother she would figure something out. Jonathan stood in the cold, knowing that if he did not act in the next few minutes, the night would become far more than an inconvenience. It would become a test neither of them should have to endure alone. Jonathan could no longer justify standing in the shadows while the cold pressed in around them. He stepped forward slowly, making sure his shoes scraped lightly against the concrete, so his presence would not feel like a sudden shock. Emily turned instantly at the sound, her body positioning itself between the doorway and her mother with instinctive protectiveness. Even in the faint wash of moonlight, Jonathan could see the tension in her small frame. He raised his hands slightly, palms open, his voice calm and steady, as he introduced himself by name and explained that he had seen her at school. Emily did not relax immediately. Her eyes searched his face, measuring him in the dim light, deciding whether he represented danger or help. Sarah tried to push herself upright, her breath uneven, asking who was there. Jonathan took another careful step inside, keeping his tone gentle, explaining that he had followed because he was concerned. The word concerned felt inadequate for the weight of the moment, but it was honest. Emily admitted quietly that she had not meant to break any rules, that she only took what she needed, never more. The confession was not defiant. It was fearful. Jonathan felt the sting of that fear. He told her she had done nothing wrong. Nothing at all. The wind moved through the broken windows again, sharper now, and Sarah's cough echoed in the dark space. Jonathan removed his coat without hesitation and draped it carefully over Sarah's shoulders, making sure it was secure. The fabric swallowed her frail frame almost completely. Emily watched every movement closely, ready to intervene if necessary, but she did not pull away. Jonathan crouched down so he was at eye level with the child and spoke plainly. He said that no one should have to spend a night in a place like this, especially when help was available. Emily's jaw tightened as she explained that shelters were full and waiting lists were long, and that they had been trying. There was pride in her voice, but also exhaustion. Jonathan understood then that this was not a single bad week. This was a system of obstacles stacked against them. He felt the collision of two worlds inside his chest, the world of private jets and quarterly reports, and the world of batteries that barely held a charge. And in that collision, something irreversible began to form. He reached for his phone this time with certainty, knowing that the next call he made would not be about business. It would be about bringing light back into this dark room. Jonathan stepped a little closer, keeping his movements slow, so Emily could see every gesture, every intention. The moonlight filtered through the broken glass above them, tracing pale lines across the dusty floor. Sarah's breathing was uneven but steady enough for the moment, though each cough seemed to pull more strength from her thin frame. Jonathan knelt down fully now, placing himself lower than Emily, so she would not feel overpowered. He told her that he funded the lunch program at her school, that he had noticed her saving food, and that he had followed not to accuse, but because he needed to understand. Emily's eyes widened slightly at that, a flicker of embarrassment crossing her face before she straightened her shoulders again. She explained in a quiet, controlled voice that her mother had been sick for months, that medical bills had swallowed their savings, and that when the apartment lease ended, they could not afford another deposit. She said it plainly without self-pity, like someone reciting facts that had long ago stopped surprising her. Jonathan listened without interrupting, the weight of her words settling over him heavier than the cold air. Sarah reached out weakly and squeezed Emily's hand, whispering that none of this was her fault. The gesture pierced him deeper than any accusation could have. He remembered sitting beside a hospital bed years ago, watching monitors glow in a darkened room, listening to the fragile rhythm of a child's breathing. The memory rose, uninvited, sharp and vivid, tightening his throat. He blinked it back, focusing on the present. Emily noticed his silence and asked softly if they were in trouble. The question struck him harder than the wind outside. Trouble. As if survival itself were something punishable. He shook his head firmly and said no, that they were not in trouble, that they deserved safety and warmth. He told them he had resources, contacts, immediate solutions. He spoke with conviction now, not as a businessman closing a deal, but as a man confronting his own blindness. Emily studied him for a long moment, searching for any sign of pity or judgment. Finding none, she nodded once, small but resolute. Outside, the temperature continued to drop, and the night pressed closer around the building. Inside, something shifted. Not yet rescue, not yet resolution. But the first fragile thread of trust had been woven in the dark. Jonathan stepped slightly aside and placed the call, his voice low but steady, as he instructed his driver to bring the car around to the alley behind the abandoned building and to contact a private medical team he trusted. He did not raise his tone, did not dramatize the situation, but there was urgency threaded through every word. When he ended the call, he returned his attention to Emily and Sarah, aware that promises meant little without visible action. He told them that within minutes a warm vehicle would arrive and that a doctor would examine Sarah tonight, not tomorrow, not after paperwork, but tonight. Emily listened carefully, her small fingers still wrapped around her mother's hand. She asked how much it would cost. The question carried more weight than it should have for a child her age. Jonathan felt something fracture inside him. He answered honestly that they would not owe anything, that sometimes help simply existed to be accepted. Sarah tried to protest softly, speaking about pride and not wanting charity. Jonathan shook his head gently and explained that accepting support during hardship was not weakness, it was survival. The wind outside howled briefly through the broken windows, reinforcing his point more effectively than words ever could. He removed his scarf and wrapped it loosely around Sarah's neck, adjusting it with careful respect. Emily watched every motion, still cautious but no longer defensive. Jonathan then crouched once more and spoke directly to her. He told her that saving half her lunch had shown him something he had almost forgotten, that strength did not always look loud or powerful. Sometimes it looked like a child choosing to be hungry so someone else could eat. The admission hung in the cold air between them. Emily's eyes glistened, though she held herself steady. In the distance, the faint hum of an approaching engine broke through the night. Headlights flickered against the cracked walls, casting moving shadows across the room. Jonathan rose to his feet, offering his hand not as command, but as invitation. The moment stretched quietly, balanced between fear and hope. Then Emily stood still, holding her mother's hand, and nodded. The night had nearly swallowed them, but for the first time light was moving toward the door. The headlights washed across the broken walls like a sudden sunrise, cutting through months of darkness in a single sweep of white light. Jonathan stepped forward as the vehicle stopped behind the building, the engine humming steadily in the cold night air. The driver moved quickly but respectfully, opening the rear door, while a medical professional followed with a small emergency bag in hand. Emily tightened her grip on her mother, uncertainty flickering across her face again as unfamiliar figures approached. Jonathan knelt beside her one more time. his voice firm yet gentle, telling her that he would not leave them, that he would stay through every step. Sarah attempted to sit up straighter, pride still clinging to her, despite exhaustion, but her body trembled with the effort. The doctor crouched down, carefully speaking in calm, reassuring tones while checking Sarah's pulse and breathing. Jonathan watched the scene unfold with a storm building inside his chest, not of fear now, but of memory. The cold air, the fragile breathing, the dim light that had nearly gone out, it all collided with an image he had carried for years. A hospital room bathed in fluorescent glow, the faint beeping of monitors. His daughter Lily lying too still beneath white sheets. He remembered the night she had whispered that she was not hungry, that he should eat instead because he looked tired. He had smiled then, not realizing those would be some of her last words. The memory struck him with such force that he had to steady himself against the car door. Standing here now, watching Emily sacrifice without complaint, watching Sarah fight to stay strong for her child, he felt the weight of every missed opportunity to truly see what was in front of him. The doctor gently suggested immediate transport to a hospital for evaluation and warmth. Jonathan did not hesitate. He nodded before anyone could question the decision. Emily looked up at him, searching his expression for doubt. There was none, only resolve. He helped lift Sarah, carefully ensuring she was supported and shielded from the cold. As they guided her toward the car, Emily's small voice trembled slightly when she asked if her mother would be all right. Jonathan met her eyes and answered with quiet conviction that she would receive the best care possible. The door closed softly behind them, sealing out the bitter air. For Jonathan, the sound felt less like an ending and more like a vow forming in the silence. The car moved through the quiet streets, city lights reflecting off the windows in blurred streaks of gold and white. Emily sat close to her mother in the back seat, holding her hand with both of hers, as if contact alone could anchor her to safety. Jonathan sat across from them, his posture upright, but his thoughts unraveling faster than the passing streetlights. The warmth inside the vehicle contrasted sharply with the cold they had just left behind, yet Jonathan felt a different kind of chill rising from memory. He could not stop seeing Lily's face in the faint reflection on the glass. The same pale skin and dim light. The same stubborn insistence that she was fine when she was not. Years ago, he had been surrounded by specialists and machines, by every resource money could buy, yet he had still lost her. The helplessness of that night had carved a permanent space inside him. A space he had filled with work, expansion, distraction. He had convinced himself that building schools and funding programs was a way of honoring her. But sitting here now, watching Emily whisper encouragement to her mother, he realized something deeper. Charity from a distance had been safer than connection up close. He had kept his grief organized, manageable, structured like his businesses. Tonight had shattered that structure. The doctor in the front seat made a quiet call ahead to prepare a private entrance at the hospital. Jonathan listened to the clinical language, the measured tone, and felt his chest tighten again. When Sarah stirred weakly, Emily leaned closer and said in a voice that tried to sound bright that everything was going to be all right, that they were just going somewhere warmer. The words struck Jonathan like an echo across time. He remembered Lily saying almost the same thing, comforting him when he had been the one falling apart. His breath caught unexpectedly, and he turned slightly toward the window, allowing the darkness outside to steady him. He understood in that moment that this was not simply about providing shelter or medical care. This was about refusing to let another child carry the weight of the world alone. The car turned into the hospital driveway, bright lights flooding the windshield. As the doors opened and staff moved efficiently to assist, Jonathan stepped out with quiet determination. The past could not be changed, but tonight he would not stand at a distance. The hospital doors opened with a soft, mechanical hum, releasing a wave of warm, sterile air that wrapped around them like something steady and dependable. Nurses guided Sarah onto a rolling bed, with careful hands, speaking in calm voices that carried reassurance rather than alarm. Emily refused to let go until the last possible second, walking beside the bed as it moved down the bright hallway. The overhead lights reflected against polished floors, so different from the cracked concrete they had left behind that it almost felt unreal. Jonathan walked just behind them, his steps measured, but his heart pounding with an intensity he had not felt in years. When the doors to the examination room closed gently, leaving Emily and him in the waiting area for a few moments, silence settled between them. It was not awkward. It was heavy. Emily sat in a vinyl chair, her feet not quite touching the floor, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Without the cold wind and the broken walls around her, she suddenly looked even smaller. Jonathan took the seat beside her, careful to leave space, careful not to overwhelm. She asked in a whisper whether her mother would need to stay. He answered honestly that the doctors would decide, but that staying would mean warmth medicine and real rest. Her shoulders lowered slightly at that. The tension that had held her upright for so long seemed to loosen by a fraction. Jonathan watched her profile under the fluorescent lights and felt the final barrier inside him collapse. He turned toward her fully and spoke with a quiet clarity that surprised even himself. He told her that he had once had a daughter about her age, that he had not always understood how brave children could be until it was too late. His voice trembled only once, but he did not hide it. Emily listened, her eyes wide, absorbing the truth without interrupting. He promised her then, not as a billionaire, not as a benefactor, but as a father who had learned the cost of distance, that she would not have to choose between hunger and love again. The words settled between them like something sacred. In that brightly lit hallway, with machines humming softly in nearby rooms and footsteps echoing in the distance, Jonathan felt grief transform into purpose. And for the first time since he had stepped into the cold shadows behind that abandoned building, he allowed himself to believe that this night could mark a beginning rather than another ending. The hours that followed unfolded with a steady rhythm of footsteps, quiet consultations, and the soft hum of hospital equipment working as it should. Sarah was admitted for observation, her body responding gradually to warmth fluids and proper medical attention. Jonathan remained in the waiting area long after most visitors would have gone home, answering calls only when necessary and silencing the rest. For the first time in years, quarterly reports and board meetings felt distant, almost irrelevant compared to the fragile progress happening behind those doors. Emily sat beside him, wrapped in a thick hospital blanket, a cup of hot chocolate warming her hands. She had fallen asleep briefly against the back of the chair, exhaustion finally overtaking vigilance. Jonathan watched her rest, noticing how even in sleep her brow furrowed slightly, as if she were still calculating tomorrow's survival. When a nurse approached to say that Sarah was stable and resting comfortably, Jonathan felt a release of tension so sudden it nearly weakened his knees. He thanked the staff with quiet sincerity, making it clear that all expenses would be covered without delay or condition. Over the next several days, he moved deliberately but thoughtfully. He arranged for a private room where Sarah could recover without stress. He contacted a trusted housing coordinator to secure a furnished apartment within walking distance of Emily's school, ensuring the lease was placed under Sarah's name so dignity remained intact. He met with social workers to streamline assistance rather than complicate it. Each decision was made with the understanding that help should empower, not overshadow. When Emily visited her mother's room after school, carrying a full meal tray that she no longer needed to divide in half, Jonathan stood quietly by the window, allowing them space. Sarah's color slowly returned, her breathing steadier with each passing day. The transformation was not dramatic, but it was real. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through clean hospital glass instead of broken panes, Emily looked up at Jonathan and smiled without hesitation for the first time. It was not a guarded smile. It was free. And in that simple expression, Jonathan felt something inside him settle into place. Rescue had begun as an urgent reaction to cold and darkness. Now it was becoming something lasting, structured not by obligation, but by intention. 2 weeks later, the air outside carried the crisp clarity of early winter, but this time it did not bite through thin fabric or creep into broken walls. Sarah stood slowly in the doorway of a modest 2-bedroom apartment, sunlight pouring across freshly painted walls and polished hardwood floors. The space was simple, yet warm, furnished with a small dining table, a comfortable couch, and beds layered with thick quilts. Jonathan remained a respectful distance behind, as Sarah stepped inside, one hand resting lightly on Emily's shoulder for balance. Her strength had not fully returned, but it was returning. Each breath came easier now. Each step carried more certainty. Emily moved through the rooms with wide eyes, touching the back of a chair, running her fingers across a kitchen counter that gleamed under clean overhead lights. She opened the refrigerator and gasped softly at the sight of shelves stocked with groceries. Not leftovers, not half portions. Enough. Jonathan watched the moment quietly, understanding that abundance could be overwhelming when scarcity had been constant. He explained gently that the lease was secured for as long as they needed, and that Sarah would have access to continued medical care and rehabilitation support. There were no cameras, no announcements, no conditions tied to public gratitude, only structure and stability built carefully around their independence. Sarah turned toward him, emotion filling her eyes, and thanked him in a voice steadier than it had been in months. Jonathan answered simply that everyone deserves a fair chance to stand again. Later that afternoon, he drove Emily back to school himself. The building looked the same as it had weeks earlier, red brick steady against the gray sky, but something fundamental had shifted. As students poured out at dismissal, Emily walked with lighter steps, her backpack no longer carrying hidden meals but homework and books alone. Jonathan stood near the entrance, observing quietly, as she joined her classmates without hesitation. When she glanced back at him, there was no fear in her expression, only trust. He understood then that justice was not always about courts or punishment. Sometimes it was about correcting an imbalance before it became irreversible. The abandoned building behind the railroad tracks still stood empty, but it no longer held their future. And in its place, something steady had been built not out of pity, but out of responsibility embraced at the right moment. Winter settled fully over the city, but inside the small apartment, warmth held steady against the cold winds outside. Sarah's recovery continued with quiet progress, measured not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in ordinary victories. She could now walk across the living room without pausing to catch her breath. She could prepare simple meals at the stove, insisting on cooking breakfast on Saturday mornings as a way of reclaiming normalcy. The first time she poured pancake batter onto a heated pan, the soft sizzle filled the kitchen with a sound that felt almost celebratory. Emily sat at the table finishing homework, glancing up every few seconds as if to confirm that the scene was real and not temporary. Jonathan visited regularly, but never intrusively, careful to respect their rhythm. He coordinated with a case manager to ensure that medical follow-ups, insurance coverage, and rehabilitation services were structured for long-term stability rather than short-term relief. He also met privately with school administrators to expand the meal program into discrete evening meal support for families in crisis, determined that no child would feel forced to divide a sandwich again. He did not attach his name to the expansion. He did not seek acknowledgement. The work itself was enough. One afternoon, Emily invited him to stay for dinner. She set the table with deliberate care, placing forks evenly beside each plate. Sarah served warm soup and fresh bread, simple but abundant. Before eating, Emily hesitated briefly, then placed her hand over her mother's and said softly that they were thankful. The words were not rehearsed. They were sincere. Jonathan felt a quiet shift inside him as he bowed his head with them, not out of ritual, but out of gratitude for presence. After dinner, Emily brought out a drawing she had made at school. It showed 3 figures standing in front of a bright yellow building with windows glowing warmly. Above them, she had drawn a wide sun stretching across the page. Jonathan studied the picture carefully, noticing that the smallest figure in the drawing stood tall, not hunched or burdened. He realized then that transformation was not only about providing shelter or care. It was about restoring a child's posture, allowing her to stand without calculating survival in every breath. Outside, the wind moved through bare trees, but inside, stability had taken root. Spring arrived quietly, melting the last traces of winter from sidewalks and tree branches, and with it came a different rhythm to their days. Sarah no longer needed frequent medical visits, only routine checkups and steady rest. She began searching for part-time work, not out of desperation, but out of readiness. The apartment felt lived in, now framed photographs on the walls, a small plant thriving on the windowsill, the scent of brewed coffee drifting through the kitchen each morning. Emily walked to school with a steadier stride, her backpack lighter, not because it carried less, but because it no longer held secrets. At lunchtime, she ate fully, laughing more easily with classmates no longer glancing over her shoulder. Jonathan noticed the change during a school assembly one Friday afternoon. He had been invited quietly without ceremony to observe the expanded meal initiative now running smoothly in the background. As children filed into the auditorium, Emily spotted him near the back row and waved without hesitation. The gesture was simple, but it carried trust unburdened by fear. Later, outside, beneath a bright blue sky, she ran up to him holding a certificate she had earned for academic improvement. Her smile was wide, unguarded, the kind that reached her eyes completely. Jonathan bent down to read it carefully, offering praise not as a benefactor, but as someone invested in her future. In that moment, surrounded by the sounds of buses starting and parents calling out greetings, He felt the quiet truth settle in his chest. Rescue had not ended the night at the hospital. It continued in ordinary afternoons like this, in certificates held proudly in laughter that did not need to be measured. And for the first time in years, the memory of Lily brought not only sorrow, but warmth. By early summer, the apartment windows were open to warm air and the distant sound of children playing in the courtyard below. Sarah had regained enough strength to accept a flexible bookkeeping position at a nearby community center work that allowed her to contribute without exhausting herself. Each paycheck, modest but earned, restored another layer of confidence. Emily finished the school year with honors, her teacher remarking on her focus and kindness toward classmates who struggled. Jonathan attended the small end-of-year ceremony, standing quietly among parents, with folding chairs set up beneath a bright white canopy. When Emily's name was called, she walked across the stage with her head high, her steps steady and assured. The applause that followed was simple but sincere. Jonathan felt a familiar ache in his chest, but it no longer carried the sharp edges of regret. It carried pride. After the ceremony, Sarah approached him with a gratitude that no longer felt fragile. She spoke about plans for the future, about saving carefully, about stability rather than survival. Jonathan listened, recognizing that his role had shifted from rescuer to supporter. He had not replaced their independence. He had helped protect it until it could stand on its own again. As the sun lowered in the sky, casting long golden light across the schoolyard, Emily ran up and slipped her hand into his. It was an instinctive gesture, unforced and free. Jonathan squeezed back gently, understanding that healing did not erase loss, but it could transform it into something that guided rather than haunted. The past would always be part of him, but it no longer defined the limits of what he could give. On a quiet Sunday afternoon near the end of summer, Jonathan found himself standing once more near the railroad tracks behind Jefferson Elementary. The abandoned building still stood there, bricks weathered and windows cracked, but it no longer held the same weight. Grass had begun to grow taller around its foundation, and sunlight streamed freely through the broken panes. Emily stood beside him, holding a small paper bag, her expression thoughtful, but not afraid. Sarah waited a few steps back, stronger now, her posture upright and steady. Emily walked forward and gently placed the bag on the concrete step. Inside was a full sandwich wrapped neatly untouched, not because it needed to be saved, but because it was an offering of remembrance. Jonathan watched quietly as she stepped back. There was no tears, no dramatic gestures, only a shared understanding that this place marked the turning point. The wind moved softly through the weeds, carrying the distant sound of a passing train. Jonathan felt the memory of that cold night flicker through his mind, but it no longer tightened his chest. Instead, it reminded him how close despair and hope can stand to one another. Emily slipped her hand into his again and looked up with a small smile. She said she was glad he had followed her that day. Jonathan answered that he was glad she had been brave enough to love someone more than herself. As they walked away together, leaving the building behind them, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the tracks. The future was not guaranteed, but it was no longer fragile. It was built on something steady now, something chosen. And in the quiet warmth of that shared step forward, Jonathan understood that sometimes redemption arrives disguised as a child carrying half a meal. Did this story leave a lasting impression on you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, rate it from 1 to 10, and tap the end screen to see another heartwarming story waiting for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, then tap the bell icon so you don't miss any new stories. Until our next story.